All right. Thank you so much, Anthony, for giving us a look at what's going on across the nation. Always never a dull moment, especially if you cover law and crime like we do here at the network. I want to bring in Natalie Jackson. She's my guest for this afternoon, and I want to turn to this Denise Williams case because we are told that the courtroom folks are gathering inside the courtroom, and the jurors have a question as they deliberate. Natalie, what could that mean?
Well, I think that it depends on what the question is, but I do think it means that the jury is really going through this jury instructions and they're really trying to understand what the jury instructions mean. Remember, conspiracy and principle are kind of hard theories for juries to accept. And here we have a case that's based on the testimony of a person who has traded his testimony for leniency. So I think the jury is really trying to get this right.
All right, now here is the question. I just got word from our trial producer. So listen to this, Natalie. This is the question. They haven't brought the jurors back in. I think we have a live shot of the courtroom as they gather. Are they back? Okay, so here's the question according to our trial producer. If we find Denise guilty of count 1, the murder charge, does that mean she's automatically guilty of count 2 as well? That was what the jurors want to know. What do you make of that?
I think that that's a problem for the defense in this case, that the jury is asking about finding her guilty of murder. I thought that that would be the hardest charge for the jury to come up with. So it's interesting that that is the question that they have.
And I want to just, I'm sorry, I just want to apologize. I was mistaken. Count 1 is the conspiracy charge.
Okay. Yes. All right. So with the conspiracy charge, that is the question that I thought that they would have more questions on, just because the conspiracy charge seems as though it is tied to the murder. So unless the jury really understands that it's not tied to the murder charge, except for the fact that it describes the conspiracy to commit the murder, they will have some trouble with that jury instruction. So I think it's actually a very smart question of the jury to give it to the judge and have the judge possibly tell them that those are two mutually exclusive charges. And I think the way that it was read in the jury instruction does kind of confuse a layperson.
Yeah, I mean, because I could understand why that would be confusing. What would be your instruction if you were the judge and they had that kind of question trying to answer something like that? My instruction would be that these are two mutually exclusive charges and they need to read the jury instruction thoroughly and consider each charge separately and not together. All right, while we're waiting for action in the courtroom, if we do get anything, we'll take you live there. I want to give us a little bit of a recap of where we stand in this case and highlight some of the critical testimony. So take a listen to this. All right, you just heard the judge's answer to the juror's question. If we find Denise guilty of count 1, which is the conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, does that mean she's automatically guilty of count 2 as well? And the judge basically says, I can't answer that type of question. It's your job to review the facts in the law and apply them. Are you surprised by that answer, Natalie?
No, I'm not. That's exactly what I thought he would say, and he would say that they had to consider each charge separately. And that's what the jury instruction says. So I think that question is an interesting question because it sort of indicates that they're leaning towards guilty on the conspiracy to murder charge.
Yeah, but another interesting point, too, is that they called, instead of saying the defendant in the question, they said, is Denise. They used her first name in the question. Do you read anything into that?
Well, I mean, there could be something read into that, except that the way the question was. Normally, when you use the first name, that shows a familiarity, but it also can show a contempt. So I think that, it just depends. But the way that the question was worded, I would think that it shows a sort of contempt.
Well, we shall see. They have been deliberating for about 3 hours now, and we're closely monitoring this trial out of Florida. We'll take you back there as soon as there's any action in the courtroom. We have to take a quick break. We'll be right back in a few minutes. Okay, again, this is a secretly recorded conversation between Brian Winchester's ex-wife, Kathy, and Denise Williams, where she is basically confronting Denise Williams about what happened. The prosecution is trying to say that this is some kind of smoking gun that proves that Denise Williams, obviously was involved in this plot. Natalie Jackson, what do you make of the recording?
The jury, or has instructed the jury, that they can use their common sense when coming to a conclusion in this case. I think in reading between the lines, there were certain things that were said in that conversation. One of the things that I wrote down was when Denise told Kathy to tell Marcus to tell Brian that I haven't said anything. So I think that is important, and how a jury...
That's the key moment that you honed in then. I haven't said anything. But
yes.
And that's implying, the prosecution is leading the jurors to believe that it's about the plot. But that's not actually said in that tape, right?
It's not actually said, and I think that the demeanor is important. The fact that Denise... is very calm and very sort of calculating and asking her questions. She never says, I had nothing to do with this. She's basically deflecting and asking and re-asking questions. Another thing that I think was important that she said in the conversation was she kept saying, this has nothing to do with you, Kathy, basically. So she never said, we didn't do this. She was saying, why are you even concerned about this? It has nothing to do with you, which is a very strange answer when someone is accusing you of plotting murder.
It's like, well, of course I'm concerned with this. Okay, let's listen to some testimony from Brian Winchester, the convicted triggerman in all of this. Well, he was convicted of the kidnapping charge, but he admitted to the whole thing. Let's listen to some testimony from him as he talks a bit about this. Okay, so this is very interesting testimony from Brian Winchester, considering what we heard from his ex-wife, Kathy Thomas, just a few minutes ago. Brian Winchester is talking about this agreement that basically neither one of them, if they were confronted by law enforcement, would mention the other person. So the prosecution is trying to imply when Kathy Thomas confronted Denise Williams, that is the agreement that she was referring to. That's a bit vague in the conversation. Would you agree, Natalie?
I would definitely agree, and I would think that that's a reasonable inference that the jury can draw.
Well, I got to tell you, my producer here is pretty good at piecing this case together for the prosecution, really thinking about the little different elements in all of the testimony that would weave a picture of what happened at that lake when Mike Williams suddenly disappeared. But again, jurors do like that smoking gun, so to speak, and this is still a case where you don't have that.
Right. This is a case that really is going to boil down to whether or not the jury believed Brian Winchester. That's the bottom line in this case. And I think that, of course, with jury instruction and him cutting a deal with the prosecutors, the defense is really resting on the fact that this is a person you cannot believe. However, the prosecution believes that his testimony corroborated by the circumstantial evidence of his ex-wife's phone call was enough to bring this case.
And how do we know it wasn't all his idea and she wasn't really a fan of it? He did it anyway, and then afterwards she said, well, I'm going to get blamed for this. Let's just keep it quiet and I'll go along with it. In other words, we're really having to take his word that this was their plan, that they conspired on this plan together. We have to take a quick break here on the Law and Crime Network, but we'll be back in just a few minutes, so stay with us. We're on Verdict Watch in the Denise Williams case. Okay, so you heard a little taste of what happened this morning. We carried it here live on the Law and Crime Network. Natalie Jackson, what do you make of the defense's attempt here to basically get a new trial?
I think its argument about the testimony shows that Laquan McDonald was advancing on Jason Van Dyke, and thus the defendant deserves a new trial. I don't think that holds water, just basically on the jury instructions. A jury can accept evidence and testimony. They can reject evidence and testimony. They can accept parts of evidence and testimony and reject parts. The defense here is basing their theory on testimony that was given. However, the jury was shown a videotape. The jury can come to their own conclusions on the videotape. They don't have to accept testimony conclusion on what they see for themselves. So I don't think that argument holds water.
So you don't think it was particularly surprising here that the judge said, no, you're being sentenced?
Yeah, no, I do not think that that's surprising at all, not with that argument.
Do you expect to see a stiff sentence when he is sentenced in January? And you know what? Finish your thought very quickly because we have to throw to a quick break. I'm sorry we didn't get you to answer there. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, they're bringing up what they think is the smoking gun, that recording that Denise Williams was part of when Brian Winchester's ex-wife, Kathy, was working on behalf of the state and tried to confront her with all of that. Natalie, what do you think of that? Do you really think it's as strong evidence as the prosecution is peddling it to be?
I don't think that it's strong evidence, but I do think it's evidence that may convince a jury. I think in this case it does answer the question of, did Brian tell the police just because he was mad at Denise? I think it could answer that question. I'm not sure if it definitively answered that question, but really the answer to that question would be that Brian told Dr. Manuka because he was concerned that Denise was going to tell the police he did it all. So I think that, it does kind of explain a little bit of Brian's motives for telling about the murder.
Absolutely there. But let's, when you're doing a summation, the prosecution's closing, what are the kind of points you would want to hit in a case like this?
I would really hammer in on the fact exactly what he did. The conversation that Denise had with Kathy a week after Brian's arrest, where she said, tell Marcus to tell Brian that I didn't say anything. I think that really is, it's not conclusive, but it's enough where a jury could decide what to make of that. And I think that with the other evidence in the case, that could definitely be the smoking gun.
Interesting. Okay, so let's listen to a little bit more of Brian Winchester's testimony when he's talking specifically about this agreement he allegedly had with Denise Williams not to talk about what happened. But here's my thing about all of this. How do we know, Natalie Jackson, that this agreement really existed, right? Because we're only hearing about this agreement from Brian Winchester. We did hear some vague reference in the tape that the prosecution played both in closings and we heard during Kathy Winchester's, or Kathy Thomas, her new name's, testimony. But how do we know this agreement actually existed?
Right, and we don't. It's just whether or not the jury believes that Brian Winchester is credible. Here's the thing, though. His testimony just now that we played about Denise finding a book that that the mother of the victim wrote in and saying that Denise was involved in the murder somehow, I think that corroborates the mother's testimony and the brother's testimony that Denise was angry at them and confronted them. So while that's not a smoking gun in itself, it does pretty much have a chain of continuation and a corroboration of other testimony. So I think that, much of what Brian Winchester said has been corroborated by the evidence in this case as far as the murder and by the circumstantial evidence that implicates Denise.
Wow, so Natalie Jackson, you're going really pro-prosecution on this. You think she's going to get convicted. They've been deliberating, I've lost count now, I think about 4 hours, maybe a little bit more now. But based on, okay, go ahead.
Murder. I don't think she'll be convicted on murder, but I do believe she'll be convicted on the conspiracy and the accessory after the fact. I think there was enough evidence to prove that in this case.
Certainly. Okay, so we're going to take a quick break, but we have more from the closing arguments that happened this morning. If you want to catch up on this case, it's a great way of doing so. And let me tell you something. When the defense had their turn, they brought up some pretty interesting points. Stay with us. Okay, so part of the prosecution's kind of hurdle that they have to get over in this trial is Brian Winchester is really their strongest witness, and he's a proven liar, and he has a major incentive to lie because he has a plea deal with the state in order to avoid a lot of time behind bars. So in the prosecution's closing, what they're really trying to do is back up what he said with evidence, saying he said this, so therefore, and we have this evidence, so therefore what he said is true. Okay, I want to bring in Natalie Jackson. She's a criminal defense attorney we've been talking to via Skype, and also Bill Kickham, a criminal defense attorney out of the Boston area. You've been on the network before, also joining us here in New York City. So glad to have you. Let's give the first question to you, Bill. You heard a little bit of the prosecution's closings there. What do you think is their biggest hurdle?
Their biggest hurdle is the credibility of the witness. I mean, he's clearly testifying for the prosecution. He's a murderer.
Yes.
The bottom line is, I think the prosecution is saying here, what of course they're saying is, don't just believe him. Believe the evidence we have.
Right.
And the evidence that they offered was, in particularity, the preparation to perpetration, that they knew the depth of the water that they were in, that they shot him, that they buried him, that they took meticulous steps to commit this crime. In other words, they're not just saying, that testimony that you heard from Mr. Winchester, that's not all we've got. What we've got is forensic evidence to back up what he's saying. So in the event you think he's not believable, just listen to this. And so they're trying to detail with particularity the evidence to convict this person.
Okay, so speaking of the evidence they're trying to detail, let's look at some of Brian Winchester's testimony that the prosecution was trying to back up during the closings. Take a listen. Okay, so that's all great. We have confirmation, that this Brian Winchester, this was part of his plan to have Mike Williams in these waiters because he thought that would be a really good way to drown this guy, push him overboard, and he'd drown right away. And then we have the testimony from the guy who found the waiters. Mike had gotten off. But Natalie Jackson, I keep going back to the fact that it is not Brian Winchester who is on trial. It is Denise Williams. So that's interesting and certainly important to what happened. But at the end of the day, does it prove that Denise Williams somehow is behind all of this?
No, that testimony does not prove it. But what the prosecution also said, and the proof of Denise Williams is Denise's involvement in this is Brian's testimony that Denise encouraged Mike to go hunting that day. Mm-hmm. So that she encouraged him to go with Brian Winchester. So I think that is where they're saying she was a principal. She conspired prior, according to Brian Winchester's testimony, she conspired with how they talked about how they would kill Mike. They even talked about how possibly they would kill Brian's wife too, and he nixed that, according to Brian. Brian. But I think the key here that a jury has to keep going back to, what incentive did Brian have to kill his best friend? Why would he kill his best friend at this point? And I think that is what the prosecution, that's the question the prosecution wants the jury to ask and wants the jury to connect the dots with the other testimony.
Well, what do you think, Bill? Do you think that enough of the dots have been connected here to get Denise Williams on this charge?
Yeah, it's interesting. It depends on what jury you're talking to and where they're from. You know, not every 12, all 12 people are the same, you know. But in this kind of thing, you are connecting dots. In other words, there's evidence of complicity and conspiracy in that Denise encouraged Mike to go fishing that day. Okay, she actively encouraged him to. So there's evidence.
But what evidence do we have of that other than Brian Winchester saying that's what happened?
Well, other than
Mike's
that,
not allowed to say, yeah, Denise told me to go fishing.
There are other factors, though. I believe that Brian sold the life insurance.
That's true.
He sold the life insurance, and he had an affair with her, so he had motive to do this. And it's not a single piece of evidence that's going to convict Denise if she's convicted. It's the multiplicity of factors involved. It's that she encouraged him to go in the boat that day. It's that she stood to benefit from the life insurance. It's that Brian sold the life insurance. It's that they were having an affair. It's the cumulative nature of the evidence that's going to convict her if she's convicted.
Okay. Bill, stay with us. We have got to take a quick break, but when we come back, you're going to hear the defense's closing, and it gets very interesting. Stay with us here on the Law and Crime Network. All right, welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. We have a busy afternoon in this. I said it before, it always comes down to the wire on a Friday afternoon when we are in verdict watch for our big cases. And I can tell you that my producer just told me that a local reporter who happened to be waiting, listening, hoping the jurors would come back, said, tweeted that they could hear laughing coming from the jury deliberation room. Now, obviously, Bill Kickham, that might not mean anything. They're sitting there for 5 hours, but it could mean something.
Exactly. It's either one way or the other. It's either an attempt to break the tension. These are people sitting in a room trying to decide someone's fate for the rest of that person's life. There's a lot of tension in the room. It could be an attempt to just break that tension. Or it could be something else. It's difficult to say. This is a tense situation for the jurors, and they could be trying to provide a little levity. They could be talking about someone's witness testimony and how unbelievable it might be. It all depends.
Well, and again, they've been deliberating for 5 hours now, and you just never know when the jurors are going to come back to return the verdict. We're going to stay live until they do, so stay with us. You will not miss it here on the Law and Crime Network. But for those of you who may have missed the defense's closings from this morning, let's play a bit more of what we heard. Take a listen. Okay, I got to tell you, I think the defense made a really, really good point in all of this. So basically, why this whole plot came to light is because Brian Winchester was arrested after Denise Williams turned him into police for trying to kidnap her at gunpoint. The defense's point in the closing was basically like, if she really was behind this huge plot that ended in the murder of her husband, why would she have gone to police about this kidnapping scheme? Natalie Jackson, what do you think of the defense's point on that matter?
I think that is their best point that they have. However, I do think a jury can look at it and say, well, you know what? She was trying to save her life at this point. So I think that, that becomes the answer to that question.
Basically, like, I don't really care. This guy's trying to kill me. Yeah, I may have been part of a murder, but I want to save my own life right now.
Right. And well, don't forget the message that she sent. Listen, I'm not going to talk about the murder if you don't. She's betting that she's banking on the fact that he'd rather face a prosecution for threatening her than a murder charge. Remember, lay people don't know about plea deals and immunity to testify against each other. These are not common things that the average person knows about. So I think she could have been banking on the fact that he would never turn himself in for a murder.
Okay. So Natalie and Bill, stay with me for a few more minutes. Let's listen to a bit more of the defense's closings. So the defense is really painting this Brian Winchester guy to be a liar, a schemer. Bill Kickham, what do you think of the defense's closings there.
You know, not bad, not bad.
Yeah.
That's what I think. They're making him out to be what he was professionally before all this started, which was what? A salesman. Okay?
Exactly,
And
yes.
what did he sell? Life insurance policies. And what are they now suggesting, okay? That he sold his own little life policy here, his own little story. A lot of what Denise and he are saying are similar to someone looking for a place to go when the Titanic is sinking, the last seat. They're just looking to save themselves. That's what's going back and forth here. And credibility of the witnesses is key here. But I thought what the defense attorney had to say in terms of he's a salesman, and he developed a new life policy that he's trying to sell, one that can save a little bit of his own skin. It was interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty good defense closing. While we're kind of reviewing the closings here, let's take it back to Brian Winchester's testimony, because of course he's the key witness in this, and how he fared during the cross-examination. Take a listen. All right, you heard it. The defense hoping those jurors find Denise Williams not guilty. Bringing in my panel, Bill Kickham and Natalie Jackson, who's been with me this afternoon. Let's start with you, Bill. What do you make of the defense's closings there? They made some pretty interesting points.
He made some interesting points, and he keeps repeating a phrase, miscarriage of justice, that to find his client guilty of these charges would be a miscarriage of justice. He also pointed to supposedly something called no prior bad acts of this defendant. In other words, he pointed to supposedly 21 years before Brian where nothing happened. She wasn't charged with anything, no criminal background history, that he implies that if she were this kind of individual, this kind of person, this kind of behavior would have been exhibited a long time ago.
Is that true, though, Natalie Jackson?
Well, let me say, I mean, the same thing can be said for Brian Winchester. He went 21 years without that type of behavior, too. So I don't know if that's something that I would buy. I think that the question is, and I think it's the question that's still on the mind, why would Brian Winchester kill his best friend that he grew up with, that he went to school with, that he admittedly talked to every day on the stand? And why would Mike Williams' mother and brother think Denise was involved? I think that their testimony is really important in this, and the fact that they believe that Denise was involved.
Very interesting. Okay, to close out the time with me and Natalie here, Bill's going to stick around for the Daily Debrief. Let's hear from the last of Brian Winchester, a little bit more of his testimony.